All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for part 3 of the grant writing series. Today we'll be covering funding sources. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Dreeben, Dr. DiStefano, and Dr. Cameron for sharing all of this with us and putting on 3 great webinars. And whenever you guys would like to begin, you can. Just a real quick thing, if you do have any questions throughout the presentation or at the end, please just type them into the chat or into the question and answers portion. I've just sent a message to everyone, so hopefully you're able to ask any questions if you would like. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So to start us with the funding sources, I'm going to begin by discussing some of the common funding mechanisms through the National Institutes of Health. Starting with the R01, R03, and R21 mechanisms, which are probably the most common research grants people talk about. Although it is important to acknowledge that there's an array of different research grant mechanisms out there. The R01 program is probably one of the most commonly used grant programs at the NIH, and it's used to support discrete, really specific research projects for a period of about 3 to 5 years. And typically you're looking at a budget under $500,000 per year. But if you want to go beyond that limit, you need to seek out advance permission from the institute that you're applying to. The R03 mechanism is for more limited funding for a short period of time, usually for things like pilots or feasibility studies or the collection of preliminary data or a secondary analysis of an existing data set. The budget here is usually limited to $50K per year for 2 years, but some R03s will be slightly different. The NIH Exploratory Developmental Grant Program, which is the R21, is for more new and exploratory high-risk type funding mechanism, is a more high-risk funding mechanism, usually for the early stages of a project's development, and this can sometimes include pilot or feasibility studies. And this grant mechanism is usually 2 years for a total of $275,000, but it's always important to go back to the program announcement and see if it's adhering to that model or if it's adapting something different. We also have 2 other commonly used mechanisms, which are the F series of grants, which are for individual fellowships. Probably the ones that you hear people talk about most are the F31, the predoctoral fellowship, or an F32 for the postdoctoral fellowship. And then we also have research career development awards, which are usually under the call symbol of K, such as a K01 or a K08 or a K23. To kind of paint a picture of where the funding could come from, you can see here a timeline that the NIH has on one of their websites, where as a graduate student, you may apply for something like an F31 to have predoctoral fellowship. And then as you complete your PhD and transition to postdoc, you may apply for that F32, the postdoctoral fellowship mechanism. And then during the postdoc period, you can begin to start applying for those K mechanism grants that'll help you transition to becoming an independent investigators. And the ones that you probably hear the most about are the K01, the K08, or the K23. Then while you're in that funding period for the 5 years with your K, or even a little bit after, you may start applying for your R03s and the R21s, trying to eventually build up to getting your R01 level grants. And then it's also important to acknowledge that the K grants also have funding mechanisms for people who are at various points during their career. So it doesn't need to just be for those early stage investigators. Mechanisms like the K24 are for people kind of more in the middle of their career. And it's also worth noting that there's a loan repayment plan that is available to investigators who are on a path to becoming independent investigators, and that's worth something to consider. And while this is the traditional path that is kind of put forward a lot, you start with the F, you go towards K, and you will start working on your R mechanisms, it might not be the best fit for you. So it's worth talking to the mentors at your institution and that you work with about what's the best path for you. For example, I started off myself with getting foundation level support during my master's research, then got scholarship support from the NATA Foundation and the EATA during my doctoral work. Then during my postdoc, I was supported by my mentor's R01 grant. And then I continued to work with several senior investigators on their R01s, which enabled me to then submit my own R01 application and get funded. And that was a path that worked for me. So it's worth communicating with your mentoring team what they think would work for you. As you're developing your grants for the NIH, it's important to have a realistic timeline and to start early in the submission process. Oftentimes starting 6 months before your deadline to really start formulating your idea and pulling it together. So for example, on the last NIH cycle that was due in February, we started planning our R01 back in August or September of 2018. We submitted it in February. It went under scientific review last week. We're currently waiting on our scores right now. In July, we'll receive our summary statement. And if it was a good score, then we would be excited to have it go forward into the advisory council, which would be in August or October, where after that we would start to hear about our potential for being funded. And that would make our earliest start date September 2019 or just sometime in that fall or winter. So essentially a year to really get going. And that's a really optimistic view. More realistic, what's going to happen is we'll get a score from our scientific merit review committee. It'll probably hopefully be a good one that might not be enough to get us funded, but based on feedback from the summary statement that we get in July, we can start revising that grant application to submit it in October. And if that's the case, then we're looking at the earliest possible start date of July 2020. So it's important to realize that with this process, you could be potentially looking at 2 years from conception of study to starting your actual data collection. So it's important to have a realistic timeline as you go. And now at this point, what I'd like to do is transition so that Ken can talk about the DoD funding.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So shift gears a little bit. I think Jeff did a real nice job talking about NIH awards. So the DoD is another major funding source. They're next to NIH, they're the second largest funding source of biomedical research in the country. So it's important to understand their mechanisms, and they don't really align directly with NIH. So they have some different quirks that it's good to understand. But overall, the grant writing process is fairly similar. So as Jeff talked about, I'll go through first the mechanisms or the primary mechanisms that are available. So the largest funding source that the DoD has is what's called the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, or CDMRP. And within the CDMRP, they have several research programs that fall under that. The ones that are probably most common or of most interest to most people in our area of research would be the Peer-Reviewed Orthopedic Research Program, or the PRORP, the Peer-Reviewed Medical Research Program. So Peer-Reviewed Orthopedic really focuses primarily on orthopedic issues. They have funded some post-traumatic osteoarthritis research in the past. However, in the last couple years, they've kind of moved away from that. And that's probably because that funding priority is now shifted to the Peer-Reviewed Medical Research Program. The Peer-Reviewed Medical Research Program is probably the biggest program that CDMRP has. It receives the most funding, but it also tries to cover the largest number of research priorities or topic areas. So there's a much larger pool of money, but there's also a lot more people competing for that money. So it's important to keep that in mind. So within the Peer-Reviewed Medical Research Program, like I said, post-traumatic osteoarthritis is typically a funding priority. Osteoarthritis has also been listed as a priority, and there have also been other priorities like musculoskeletal injury prevention, outcomes, things that are related to that. So that really is a program that people may want to look at. Psychological health and traumatic brain injury is another area that may be of interest, maybe not related directly to post-traumatic osteoarthritis or OA, but for people in our profession of athletic training or sports medicine, that may be another program that may be of interest. Similar to the funding mechanisms that Jeff talked about with NIH, most of the CDMRP awards are 3 to 5 years, depending. It just really kind of depends on what mechanism you're applying for. Some are shorter, but in general, they're about 3 years. So in terms of some of the funding mechanisms, I will talk about that briefly. just aligned almost similarly with NIH. DoD has some clinical trial planning grants that can be used to help organize and prepare for submitting a grant proposal for a clinical trial to try and get everything in order for that. So they've been funding those more recently. The Discovery Award is similar to the R21 through NIH. So this is really more of a high risk, high reward grant. A lot of times they do not require a substantial amount of preliminary data, and some calls will actually say that preliminary data cannot be submitted. Your grant could actually be rejected if you submit preliminary data for an award, a discovery award that requests no preliminary data. So it's important, again, to read the funding announcement and make sure you understand all those requirements. There's also the Investigator-Initiated Award, which is similar to the R01. Again, this is usually a mechanism that an investigator will apply to. It has to address one of the funding priorities that's highlighted in the program announcement. But if you are aligned with one of those, you can submit for that, which carries, again, between $750 to $1 million over a 3-year funding period about. Sometimes within the CDMRP mechanisms, so NIH almost always, I think, will have your direct costs, and then they will provide for indirect costs above that. Sometimes the DoD will do that, so it's important to, again, read the program announcement. But sometimes they'll say, $750 for total costs, or $1 million over 3 years for total costs, which will include your direct and your indirect costs. So it's important to understand that when you're planning your budget. The Transitional Research Partnership Award is an award that really is designed to match perhaps a clinical scientist with a basic scientist. So someone who's doing maybe cell research in the laboratory with somebody who's doing similar research in the clinical setting to try and translate that information into clinical practice. So that's usually what those awards are for. At least two partnership or two researchers will combine and partner on that award. Technology and Therapeutics Development Award is really designed for something that helps develop interventions or technologies that can be used clinically. And then a clinical trial award is pretty straightforward, I think. Some key points that differentiate NIH from DoD. So typically with these programs, there's only one call per year. They typically will have a call, or sometimes they'll have a pre-announcement to let you know that the announcement is coming, so you can start getting prepared to submit something. Usually that call comes once a year. Most of the mechanisms now require either a letter of intent or a pre-proposal that is reviewed, and then you get invited whether or not you get to submit a full proposal. There's typically no continuation funding. So NIH, this is one difference between NIH and DoD. With NIH, you can, if you get an R01, you can submit another funding mechanism to continue that work down the road if you've made significant or substantial progress on that. DoD really doesn't have that. Anytime you apply for another grant through them, it's just like you're starting from scratch with a new grant. Another thing is that funding priorities may change annually. So again, I'll talk about that when we talk about the process a little bit more. But if post-traumatic osteoarthritis was a funding priority this year, there's no guarantee that it will be a funding priority next year. So it's just important to, again, read the program announcement when it comes out. But again, I think looking historically at what they funded in the past gives you a good idea about what they may continue to fund in the future. And then, any funding that comes through the congressionally directed medical research programs are really contingent on annual appropriations. So that really drives what they're able to do in terms of funding through each program. Next slide. And so this just provides an example of the CDMRP funding timeline. Again, usually there's a stakeholders meeting, which may include investigators in the research area, may include military service members who are affected by the disease or the injury or the condition that is being studied. And those people get together along with program managers for CDMRP, and they discuss what are the current gaps, what are the priorities, and they help come up with what those research priorities should be. Then congressional appropriations come in. There's a vision setting where they kind of combine that information, the available funding, as well as the priorities or the gaps that are out there as determined by the stakeholder meeting. The program announcement is then developed and released. Again, there may be a pre-application deadline where you submit your pre-proposal or your pre-application. There may be a period of time after that where those are reviewed, and then only certain grants that meet the desired criteria and are aligned with the funding priorities get invited to submit a full proposal. Once you do that, your proposal goes under peer review. So peer review is really primarily focused on the scientific aspects of your proposal, but another difference between NIH and DoD is that they have a two-level review process. So they try and fund based on portfolio status and not necessarily on the best overall scientific merit. So scientific merit is important, and it's something that's highly weighted. That's what the peer review committee does for peer review. But when it gets to the programmatic level, they'll look at portfolio balance as well as scientific merit in making funding decisions. So after that, decisions are made. You may get a letter saying that you were recommended for funding, which is always a good thing, or you may get a letter saying that you were not recommended for funding, in which case, again, different from NIH, you don't get a summary statement and have an opportunity to resubmit. You basically have to go back to square one and submit next year, but you don't get any credit for having submitted previously. Once funding recommendations are made, again, those are reviewed by the decision authority, and then award notifications are put out. After that, there may be negotiations that go into your award similar to NIH. And then once that happens, the award becomes active, and that continues on. So again, it can take several months, 12 to 24 months from the time you really start submitting your grant to the time you start getting funded and start getting to get started on the work. Next slide. Again, this just kind of provides a little bit different look, or a little bit closer look at the differences between NIH and DoD in terms of the review process, the two-level review. So again, peer review is really focused on scientific merit. It's really based on the evaluation criteria that is stated in the program announcement. And typically, again, they will develop a summary statement very similar to what you get from NIH about the strengths and the weaknesses of your application. Again, those scores will go forward to the programmatic review committee, and they will do the second level review where they really look at, do we already fund a lot of stuff in this area? Maybe if we do, we don't, even though this may be very highly meritorious scientifically, it may not be something that fits in the portfolio. So they may choose something that has a little bit lower score coming out of the peer review, but is something that really addresses an important gap that they have in the portfolio. Next slide. Some additional DoD programs that provide research support. So these are the Defense Medical Research and Development area. So JPC stands for Joint Program Committee, and these are some of the areas that they have. The ones that are probably most of interest to us are Military Operational Medicine Research Program, JPC-5, or the Clinical and Rehabilitative Medicine Research Program. Next slide. So again, if we talk about JPC-5 or the Military Operational Medicine Research Program, these are the things that they typically will fund. They focus on injury prevention, which again may be of interest to us, as well as injury reduction. Psychological health, again, may be of interest to us, particularly as we're learning more about how that may affect return to activity with people who have had a joint injury and may be at risk for OA or PTOA. They also look at environmental effects, which again may not be salient to us specifically, but people in our field may be interested in heat illness and high altitude effects on performance and some of those things, which JPC-5 funds. Next slide. And then finally, the Clinical and Rehabilitative Medicine Research Program really focuses more on neuromusculoskeletal injury rehabilitation and outcomes from that rehabilitation. So again, there may be some areas there that could be funded. Also, sensory systems following traumatic injury, as we start to learn more about neural pathways and neural changes after joint injury. This may be an area where where people in our field may find funding mechanisms that are aligned with that. Next slide. And then finally, there's the last funding mechanism that is available through DoD is what's called the broad area announcement, or the broad agency announcement. Can be called either. For some reason, they like to go back and forth about that. But these are typically open applications, so you can apply anytime. Typically, you will submit a pre-proposal and then you will receive an invitation if they like it enough to submit a full proposal. One concern or thing you should know about this funding mechanism is that typically there's no funding allocated for that. So what typically happens is that the DoD gets a large, bolus of money when they get their annual funding. That money is used throughout the year, but at the end of the year, they may have leftover funds, and those funds get pulled back from everybody's budgets. So what happens is if there are leftover funds at the end of the year, they may fund some of these projects that they determine are meritorious. So it's not like they're going to give out a certain amount of money every year, but they're, typically it's fairly common that they do have money left over, and they may fund 2 or 3 or 4 projects if it's something that's of high priority and high scientific merit. And it doesn't prevent you from submitting to some of the other programs as well. So, you could submit something and have it, in there with the broad agency announcement. It may not get funded the first year, but if it's something that they really like, they may keep it around, and you may get a call 2 or 3 years later saying, "Hey, we finally found some money for this. Do you still want to do this work? Are you still in a position to do this work?" And you may get funded, and it may happen faster than that too. But that's just one thing, another funding mechanism that is out there that people should probably be aware of. And I think I'll turn it over to Lindsay. We'll talk now about other funding sources, primarily foundation grants and some other agencies that could fund research in the areas that we're interested in.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, so as Ken mentioned, I'm going to just briefly talk about looking at different mechanisms of funding sources that are common among sort of athletic training professionals. And obviously, I think, I can only speak to a small sample of these. There are a lot of different funding sources, different organizations that we might not even be aware of that we really, as a profession, need to explore. And so you can progress forward. The biggest thing with the foundation level funding support is that these grants tend to be more of your typical money. They're usually a lot lower than the NIH or the DoD might have, although the Hood Foundation, which was on that previous slide, the Charles Hood Foundation for Child Health Research Awards, that's an example of a new investigator award. It's primarily located for investigators in New England. I believe that is a criteria for the PI, but the granting amounts are $75,000 per year for 2 years. So it's a pretty decent amount there. And then obviously the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation also can deliver pretty decent amounts of funding. But otherwise, a lot of the foundation funding tends to be sort of in the ballpark of less than $50,000. The other thing with the foundation funding is there's huge variability in terms of whether or not the foundations or these organizations will allow indirect costs. If they allow indirect costs, a lot of times they have a fixed percentage. And so those are things that you really want to make sure, your office-sponsored programs or whoever helps you with grants, make sure that you communicate and understand prior to submission. The other thing that with the foundation funding is sometimes, actually a lot of times they also have budget restrictions in terms of whether or not they will support the investigator's salary, or they might have different travel requirements that they do or do not allow, or some other things that I've seen. So those are just things that you really need to make sure that you're reading the guidelines because they are definitely not one size fits all. Then we get to the audience, and this is really important. You need to think about and look into who's serving on the grant review panels for these foundations, because they definitely can differ and will impact your results. So for example, the Charles Hood Foundation, I was fortunate to talk to a previous award winner, which again is always a great tip for any grant submission, is to try to speak with somebody who's been awarded in that mechanism recently from that funding agency. But I found out that the majority of the grant reviewers tended to be primary care pediatrician type positions, so not your typical researcher. And so from that perspective, we were encouraged strongly to make sure that the grant application was written with, very high impact language, and, to basically stay away from too tedious of grant methodology. language, which obviously that can differ depending on the funding agency. As always, make sure that your grant is written so that it specifically identifies the priorities of the foundation. Almost always, I try to make a very, like a shaded area, even in a box. Do something that clearly highlights that you recognize what the priorities, what the mission, the values of that funding agency is, and exactly how your project represents those funding priorities. Because oftentimes that's a key marking in terms of their review. They probably actually have to provide to the funding agency exactly how your grant addresses those priorities. So if you can make it easier for the review team, then obviously your likelihood of success will dramatically increase. The other thing is, like, a lot of these funding agencies have perhaps just differences in terms of even what they perceive as priorities. Obviously, like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the child or the culture of wellness and health, the call to action is a lot of times what those proposals are called. And by the name, you can obviously interpolate that these grants should be focused on improving the culture of health and wellness around. However, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is known that they actually really like larger sort of scale projects that are very problem-based. And in terms of actual implementation of a project, not just the research study. Yes, you need to have a research component, but they really want to make sure that you are hitting the ground running and your project itself will make an impact. And so those are things that you really need to twist your traditional grant around to address. EATA and ATA Foundation, both of those, I can tell you that the grant review requires how the grant specifically addresses the athletic training profession. So be very deliberate in how you have that language. The other thing with the foundation funding is they vary with due dates, and sometimes they are not consistent across years for the due date. So Ken and I have been serving on the EATA Research Committee, being in charge of the grants, and I can tell you, we're going to have 3 different due dates in a matter of 2 years, and that's just because we're trying to sort of change our cycle to align better with the academic calendar. But so you really need to be on the lookout and keep a close eye on that. Some of these foundations also have rolling deadlines, so they actually don't have strict deadlines, so that's something else to consider. But you can ask the program officer, is there a specific time of year when you get the most proposals, or what their recommendations are? And oftentimes they can kind of tell you, and they might know sort of what funding's coming in, or when there's a meeting, or a new priority has sort of come to their mind. So those are all great to have active discussions about. Eligibility, again, this is something that it can really differ across funding agencies. As I mentioned, the Charles Hood Foundation, it's a new investigator grant. New investigator, just like the NIH, the different funding agencies might describe a new investigator very different. Sometimes it's 10 years, sometimes you must be sort of pre-tenure. So take a close reading at that. How they sort of explain or describe or define program officers also can vary. So don't be afraid to, shoot an email out to their contact officer and whoever's listed in terms of on their website, but don't be surprised either if they pass you along to somebody else, as rules often change within these foundations. And basically all this comes down to is spend some good time, do your homework with the guidelines that they have written. When you contact sort of the contact person for that grant and that agency, I would oftentimes mention that you've looked at the guidelines that are posted currently at the website, perhaps have some very clear questions from those guidelines to ensure that you're looking at the most up-to-date guidelines they have. Next slide. And so I just put out 2 different funding agencies, the American Council on Exercise and the NATA Foundation, to provide sort of a comparison and contrast between what 2 different foundations can look like in terms of their guidelines. So American Council on Exercise doesn't require a pre-proposal, the NATA Foundation does. So a pre-proposal, a very brief description of the grant project, and then you receive word back on whether or not they would like to see your full grant, which is a nice a nice method to have before you go and you spend all the time producing the full grant. It's their way of sort of weeding out perhaps some projects that they do not already think could be potentially funded. The American Council on Exercise, they have no real posted sort of grant deadlines, and it's actually even challenging to find that they have these grants available. So, and that's something also to keep in mind. If you find an organization that you think probably should have a grant mechanism, just reach out to them and inquire, because sometimes their websites just aren't as user-friendly and easy to find them, but they actually do have them. And then if you think about it, your competition is probably much lower, which equals higher acceptance rates, which is wonderful. American Council on Exercise, too, also doesn't have a firm budget limit. When I first applied to them, I heard no firm budget limit, and you're like, is this a $5,000 grant? Is this $100,000? What are we talking about? And so I had to have a conversation, and I still wasn't getting a firm answer of what my odds were like if I handed them a $100,000 grant, how would that be perceived? And so just had some more discussions, and then was able to strategize with them a plan to sort of go sort of at a smaller limit, and then with plans to submit a larger grant upon the completion of your first grant. And that's where some of these smaller organizations can be really advantageous, especially for a young investigator, because you can start to line up perhaps several years of funding. American Council on Exercise does not include indirect costs, versus the NATA Foundation does provide 10%. The other thing with the NATA Foundation is there are various grant categories, and at some point you might actually be able to qualify for both the new investigator and the general grant. So that comes into play in terms of what your project really needs, and typically, and asking the NATA Foundation, for example, for their acceptance rates or how many proposals they got in the previous year for each category to understand sort of your odds. And then the grant application themselves, absolutely differ. So the American Council on Exercise has, I would say, more of your traditional perspective in terms of a problem statement, hypotheses, and a background rationale, method significance, and dissemination plans. The NATA Foundation is a little bit more streamlined, and then I can tell you, for example, like the EATA, these grants were working hard to actually put them into an R03 NIH format, just to, again, encourage investigators within the athletic training profession to go after these NIH projects and be well trained to do so. And so it's easier if some of these funding agencies do have similar proposal guidelines, and it makes it easier to sort of recycle projects and try to submit a couple different places to improve your funding success. Next slide. Right. So I think that provides a good conclusion and overall to this webinar. And I think at this point we'll see if there's any questions.
Yeah, great. So don't forget, you can ask your questions in the webinar chat or in the question and answer section. I have a question just to get started, and I think that this may apply more towards the foundational funding, but is there any good resources that you recommend in terms of searching for more of the foundational funding? Because I feel like it's a little bit harder with all of the different organizations that you can potentially seek out.
Fantastic question. So I'll definitely be curious to see what Jeff and Ken may have to add to my response. But I will say, talking to others, I think this webinar and just networking with others that have similar sort of research agendas as yours, you can definitely sort of inquire, see what's been successful. The more that we've been able to create different, smaller research groups, I think that can also help investigators find some of these mechanisms. I know different universities, like here at UConn, we have like a database which allows faculty here at UConn to be able to sort of have a streamlined approach for searching for different foundations. And our Office of Sponsored Programs also provide some, sort of support. If you tell them what you're looking for, they can oftentimes assist. So, my biggest recommendation for anybody is just ask. Even places where you think they might not be able to provide support, you never know. They might know somebody who, can further help you. But that's definitely can be a challenging task, especially early in a career.
Yeah, no, I think what Lindsay said is spot on. I think, you know, like she said too, that a lot of times these smaller organizations or organizations that kind of have these smaller grant programs, they don't publicize them very well. So again, that may be hard because they're hard to find, but it's also probably worth the work sometimes because there may not be a lot of people applying. Because if you're having trouble finding it, then everybody else is probably having trouble finding it too. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Talk to other people that are getting funded. You know, where are they having success? You know, NFL Charities is another one. NBA has been funding some things. I think they've been more focused in other areas than OA research, but definitely in athletic training area. That, you know, those are other funding sources. So I think a lot of these are out there, but a lot of people just don't necessarily know about them. And I think, you know, as Lindsay also said, you know, it's really important to kind of understand the organization that you're applying to and how those organizations are changing. You know, with the NATA Foundation, for example, with the, you know, the new research agenda that's coming out, you may see some changes in how grant funding happens going forward and what the priorities are. So I think it's important to understand, you know, those things and be aware of those types of changing winds and how you may position yourself to be competitive for grant funding if an organization's, you know, priorities are changing. And again, a lot of that comes from talking to the program manager or other people who are at the foundation or the organization that is, you know, you're thinking about applying to, so you can kind of understand, you know, what their research priorities are, because those may change before they update their website.
Okay, great. I don't have any other questions. Is there anything else that you guys would like to add to end this seminar?
Just to highlight Lindsay's point, I would definitely suggest, even especially with the NIH, to reach out to your program officers as you're preparing your grant application to get input from them on how it aligns with the mission and long-term research plans for the agency that you're submitting to.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Lindsay touched on too was eligibility. You know, some of these organizations, you know, for example, the NATA requires that you're a member or you have a member, I think, involved. They don't have to be the PI, but maybe they're involved. You know, some organizations, some of the other organizations, professional organizations that give out grants, you know, have similar rules. So just be aware of those rules. And you know, from the DoD side, you know, the CDMRP just put out a webinar series on most of their funding mechanisms within the last 6 months. You know, those are fairly fresh, so those are also good ways to get more information about the DoD funding if you're interested.
Also, don't ignore the potential internal funding that your institution has. A lot of institutions will have internal funding to help with pilot testing or to promote collaboration between departments.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much for all of the time that you guys have spent through these past 3 webinars. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for hosting.